Sunday, July 16th, 1054. 3 papal representatives entered the Hagia Sophia, the mother church of Constantinople, and disrupted the divine liturgy. That's the Eastern Church's term for what we call the Mass. They walked through the nave under the iconic dome and approached the sanctuary, interrupting the liturgy. Pulling out a piece of paper, they placed it on the altar. It was a formal decree of excommunication directed at the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Carularius. One of the subdeacons serving during the divine liturgy grabbed the paper and quickly tried to hand it back to the papal representatives, but they wouldn't take it, and the paper just fell to the floor. The Pope's ambassadors turned and walked out of the church through the same doors they entered. No words were exchanged, no punches thrown. It was merely the sound of a giant tearing, not of paper, but of the Christian church. This event on July 16th, 1054 is what is known as the Great Schism, the divorce between the Western Church, what we now call the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, what we call the Eastern Orthodox Church. Or maybe this wasn't really a Great Schism, but rather a convenient date to pin on the fallout between the Western and the Eastern Christians. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for joining me today as we continue our series on the 21 Ecumenical Councils. I am so moved that so many of you not only found this podcast, but have found it to be helpful in your own study of Catholicism. And I am grateful for those of you who say, you know what, if I saw Justin in a coffee shop, I'd totally buy him a cup of coffee. But because I'm probably not super likely to run into him at a coffee shop, I'm going to use that $5 to help support his podcast. So to you patrons out there, thank you. This is part 14 of our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils, a series we began way back in episode 146. So far, we've talked about 8 councils, beginning with the First Council of Nicaea in 325. All of them were convened by the Emperor of Constantinople, and they all took place in modern-day Turkey. 2 in Nicaea, 1 in Ephesus, 1 in Chalcedon, and 4 in the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. In the last episode, however, we saw a major shift occur. Whereas the first 7 ecumenical councils dealt with Christological debates, the 8th council, aka the 4th Council of Constantinople, which occurred in 869 and 870, addressed the Patriarch Photius, who was appointed through irregular means and who stoked the fire of division between Constantinople and Rome. Nearly 200 years have passed between that episode and the one we're going to discuss today. I want to turn our attention to the year 1049. That's when St. Pope Leo IX began his reign as Pope. In the last episode, I mentioned St. Pope Nicholas I, who died in 867, just before the 4th Council of Constantinople. Between Nicholas's reign and Leo IX's reign in 1049, there were some 44 papacies, accounting for some oddities like Benedict IX, who had 3 different stints as Pope. Of those 44 popes, between St. Nicholas I and Leo IX, none of them are canonized saints or are even considered a blessed. Let's just say that those 180-something years weren't exactly a bright spot in the history of the papacy or in the Western Church. For one, the popes weren't worthy moral examples. I talked about a couple of popes during this period of history in episode 112 on the worst popes. There was the vindictive Pope Stephen VI, who had his predecessor Pope Formosus dug up from his grave so that he could put him on trial. Surprise, the deceased Pope Formosus was found guilty on all charges. There was Pope John XII, who was just 18 years old when he was elected Pope in 955. He basically turned the Vatican into a brothel, had lots of mistresses, and is considered by some as the Pope with the worst reputation. Pope John XII died in 964 around the age of 27 when he was thrown out of a window by a man who found him in bed with his wife. Then there was the aforementioned Pope Benedict IX, who became Pope in 1032 at the age of 20. One historian characterized his rule this way, quote, "It seemed as if a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest occupied the chair of Peter and profaned the sacred mysteries of religion by his insolent courses," end quote. The people were so fed up with his immoral filth that they forced him out of Rome. However, he returned and deposed the new pope. Then he sold the papacy to his godfather, but like a bad penny, he eventually came back and ruled for a 3rd time before finally being exiled once and for all. If the papacy was being bought and sold, you can imagine how simony was affecting other offices in the church. Being a bishop or an abbot came with significant amounts of land, and so Buying church offices, despite the ecumenical councils forbidding it, was quite normal. With Pope Leo IX's reign in 1049 came some serious reforms, and the man he put in charge of implementing many of those reforms was Hildebrand of Savannah, who later became Pope Gregory VII. He was one of the popes I talked about in episode 113 on the Great Popes. That was what was going on in Rome. Now let's turn our attention to Constantinople. From 1049 to 1053, the Byzantine Empire was preoccupied with the Pecheneг Revolt, which began when 15,000 soldiers of Pecheneг origin who were fighting for the Byzantines decided to revolt and fight against the Byzantines. That meant that Constantinople was too preoccupied with fighting a war on its front lines to send reinforcements to its western territories like the Italian peninsula. Rome was once again left without proper defenses. That was a particular problem because the Normans, which were Norse Vikings who settled in northern France, were invading the Italian peninsula one city at a time, conquering one stronghold and then using that as a base to conquer another. As they gained territory, they would seize churches and strip them of anything valuable. The Normans in these parts acted very independently. It wasn't a unified effort at all. Think of it more like these tribal armies all doing their own independent thing. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, we'll just call him Monomachos from here on out, needed to do something about it because Rome, after all, was part of Byzantine territory. Monomachos, wanting to protect Byzantine interests in the west, tried to tame the Normans by getting some of these micro-armies to become Byzantine mercenaries. However, when that didn't work, a papal army assembled hoping to defeat the Normans. However, in 1053, the Normans banded together and succeeded in defeating the papal army, and they even took Pope Leo IX captive for 10 months. On top of all of this, there were tensions between the Eastern and Western churches. Some of these debates were probably more cultural than theological, but as often happens when you have conflicting factions, even the most minute differences become amplified. For example, in the West, they used unleavened bread for communion, whereas the Eastern churches used leavened bread. These differences prompted different responses in Constantinople. For one, the Patriarch Carolarius closed a bunch of Latin-speaking churches. But the catalyst for what would ultimately lead to the events of July 16, 1054, was a letter from the Bishop of Ohrid in Bulgaria addressed to Pope Leo IX. He criticized the Western or Latin Church for their differing practices. Because the Bishop of Ohrid was a Byzantine Christian, the assumption in Rome was that the letter was influenced by Carolarius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. One disagreement that has been an ongoing theme in this series is how much authority did the Pope have? Constantinople was the hub of political power, and so that bled into the ecclesiastical realm. I guess if I could give an analogy, I live in the United States, and so there's sometimes this attitude of American exceptionalism, like we know better than bishops from other continents. So take, for example, the Pope talking about issues like pro-life or concern for immigration. There's this tendency for Catholics in the U.S. to treat the Pope's concern with disdain or indifference. Like saying, well, Pope, that's well and good and all, but you just don't appreciate our situation. That's kind of like how things were between Constantinople and Rome. Pope Leo IX wrote a stern reply, chastising Patriarch Carolarius of persecuting the Latin Catholics, and he sent that letter with 3 papal legates who arrived in Constantinople in April of 1054. The Pope's ambassadors met with Emperor Monomachos to discuss how they could better work together to defeat the Normans. They also brought up the letter that they thought was influenced by Patriarch Carolarius. They eventually also met with Patriarch Carolarius. While the meeting with the emperor was cordial, the meeting with the patriarch was contentious. We do not know if Patriarch Carolarius knew about the letter that was sent to Pope Leo IX, but the papal ambassadors were under the impression that he influenced that letter, or at the very least, shared the sentiments that were expressed in that letter. Ultimately, the papal legate wanted an apology from Patriarch Carolarius, but it appears that Emperor Monomachos was trying to create a buffer between the papal legate and the patriarch. His primary concern was a good relationship with the Pope so that they could defeat their common Norman enemy. As a gesture of goodwill, Emperor Monomachos brought out a monk who was on bad terms with him. The monk had written a treatise, and the emperor forced the monk to apologize to the papal legate and burn his treatise in front of them. It's likely that Monomachos did this because he needed to make someone the scapegoat to help appease the papal representatives, and instead of forcing his patriarch Carolarius to apologize, he threw the monk under the bus instead. The papal legate never got another meeting with Patriarch Carolarius, and perhaps that frustrated them so much that they finally stormed into the Hagia Sophia on a Sunday morning when they knew Carolarius would be there celebrating the Divine Liturgy, and that's when they issued a decree of excommunication. However, perhaps this was a bit of a bluff. You see, shortly after the papal legate arrived in Constantinople, Pope Leo IX died. That was April 1054. By July, they certainly would have learned of the Pope's death. Perhaps they issued the decree of excommunication because they knew it wasn't enforceable since the chair of St. Peter was vacant. I talked a little bit about sede vacante, which means empty chair, the term we use between a pope's death and the election of a successor, in episode 137. You may be under the impression that the papal legate slammed down the formal excommunication, and that was it. That was the end of the relationship between the East and the West. They went back to Rome and said, "We hereby no longer associate with the East." But that's not really what happened at all. There were a number of interactions that occurred afterwards between Rome and Constantinople that never mentioned this event. My opinion about the Great Schism is that it was later historians who tried to put a definitive date on the fallout between Rome and Constantinople, and this event seemed just about as good as any. It reminds me of a high-profile divorce like Prince Charles and Princess Diana, where historians tried to do a forensic analysis and say, this is the moment that really tanked that relationship. I think that's the case with historians who try and pinpoint a date for the Great Schism. The Great Schism sounds a lot more dramatic than the gradual souring between Rome and Constantinople. In reality, if you've listened to these episodes, there are a whole host of moments that could serve as the catalyst for the Great Schism, particularly everything we talked about in the previous episode. This was a rather mild event in the contentious history between Rome and Constantinople in comparison to what would happen down the road. For example, in April of 1182, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos launched an ethnic genocide against the Latin-speaking community in Constantinople. Known as the Latin Massacre, this resulted in 60,000 Latins killed or forced to flee, and 4,000 survivors being sold as slaves. In 1204, exactly 150 years after the date traditionally given to the Great Schism, the Latin Catholics responded as part of the Fourth Crusade. They laid siege to the city of Constantinople, ultimately killing 2,000 citizens and looting its gold and silver. In the next episode, we'll talk about Ecumenical Council number 9, the First Lateran Council, which occurred in 1123, some 253 years since the 8th Ecumenical Council and 69 years after the Great Schism. It would be the first time that an ecumenical council would be held in the West. In fact, never again would there be an ecumenical council held in the East. I want to end this episode by saying this. To me, the Great Schism is far more regrettable than the division that happened in the Protestant Reformation. And the reason I think that is because Catholics and Orthodox share a nearly identical faith. Are there some differences? Yes, without a doubt. But nothing like the differences between Catholics and Protestants. The fact that the Catholic Church is made up of 24 particular churches and only one of them is Western, the other 23 particular churches are Eastern, something I talked about in episode 63 called Not All Catholics Are Roman Catholic, is proof that this is not an insurmountable hurdle. The Catholic Church allows the Eastern Catholic churches to retain their own rights. In fact, it encourages them not to adopt the Roman liturgy, and they aren't even required to say the Filioque when they recite the Creed. I am hopeful that we will see even more reunification between the West and the East. And what gives me optimism is seeing some of the acts of humility that have taken place since the early 2000s. Pope John Paul II said, quote, "It is tragic that the assailants who set out to secure free access for Christians to the Holy Land turned against their brothers in the faith. The fact that they were Latin Christians fills Catholics with deep regret," end quote. And on another occasion, while Bartholomew I, Patriarch of Constantinople, was visiting the Vatican, Pope John Paul II asked, quote, "How can we not share, at a distance of 8 centuries, the pain and disgust?" End quote. Patriarch Bartholomew I, in his own address, stated, quote, "The spirit of reconciliation is stronger than hatred," end quote. And at a later time noted, quote, "The spirit of reconciliation of the resurrection incites us toward reconciliation of our churches," end quote. Perhaps a great mending is not too far off in the distant future. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.